society continues to experience the effects of more and more extreme events, like hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and drought. Some as a result of our changing climate, and others as a result of our expanding population.
There are a lot of things that have us very worried. One is the amplification of the water cycle, where we have more experience with drought and flooding. Another is that you get a lot more energy in the ocean waters. And as a result, storms can get a lot stronger. And that's exactly what we've been seeing in recent years. You had Typhoon Haiyan, strongest storm at landfall in recorded history. And then more recently, we had Patricia, which is the strongest hurricane on record, winds of 200 miles per hour. And there was a terrific amount of warmth in the ocean, not only at the surface, but also to a great depth.
We need to continue to address lessons learned, and more importantly, identify what future actions it will take to help mitigate the impact of these devastating, life-changing events.
In order to prepare for the future, we really have to have the physical, chemical, and biological sciences all together. That's what we mean by Earth system science. It really teaches us what the planet is, what it's doing. It tells us what the future is going to be so that we can take actions, in some cases to mitigate what's happening, in some cases to prepare for it. But it really is the knowledge that we need to protect the people, to help the people the remainder of this century.
And our knowledge of Earth system science will continue to improve as technology advances. Let's take, for example, Hurricane Katrina. Imagine if a similar hurricane hit 50 years from today. How much better equipped will we be? Well, perhaps a new buoy system could provide a big chunk of crucial information. In 2005, and even today, we rely on a sparse network of fixed buoys, like this one, to get sea surface conditions. That translates to about one buoy in an area about the size of Colorado. So unless a tropical system goes right over that buoy, which happens perhaps once every 10 years, the buoy won't help. And even if it does go over that buoy, the data is just from that one spot. Fast forward 50 years to 2065. Remote controlled buoys with micro GPS. We'd be able to send them wherever they're needed. By positioning a batch of these buoys in the path of a storm, the real-time surface data would be invaluable. And then add LiDAR to each buoy. It's a laser capable of measuring the winds up to 1,000 feet. These buoys could move with the hurricane in areas that are unsafe to be in, but measuring real important stuff, like sea spray. That is a huge help with intensity forecasting. The buoy system, deployed drones, and enhanced satellite imagery could all improve our understanding of physical, chemical, and biological sciences. But how will this translate socially?
Social sciences can help us learn how people use the information, how they think about weather-related risks, and how we can communicate the information better. For example, a weather forecast isn't any good unless someone can understand it and use it. And so we have a project right now where we're looking at how people talk about weather on social media. There's a lot now, for example, with image sharing that people are talking about. How can we use that to help predict the weather, to help understand who's at risk, to help verify weather forecast information. So I think looking forward, it's really hard to imagine what that next technology is going to be, but I think that as meteorologists, we really need to be adaptive to what's happening and try to understand kind of how things are evolving and keep up with them.
What we've got now is a whole new playing field. We're not in Kansas anymore. And so weather's going to be extremely important to people as the planet is actually changing. We're going to need a lot of people to figure that out and a lot of people to be able to communicate that effectively.
We are specially entrusted to work on the kind of science that will help us so that these disasters in the future, people are not so badly affected. They're much better off. Good morning. We have a great week for everyone, starting with this forum and a really terrific meeting addressing this issue, Earth system science and how we serve society. We at this presidential forum have had a really great group plan it, and I want to just mention the names. First of all, Mary Cairns, who really did everything, fabulous, creation of this. Heidi Santola, Patricia Pooh, Annie Reiser, Scott McCarroll, and the AMS staff. So please stand up, and I want everybody to thank them. And how about that video? I think a fabulous look at why it's so important, what you do, what we all do together, and especially the role that the society can play in helping us in the future prepare this world, prepare it for today, the kind of severe weather events that are so common, prepare us for the long term, what's going to happen with a changing planet and increasing population. The theme of this forum is Serving Society in Times of Crisis, Past, Present, and Future. And we were lucky to get really great panelists. We were also lucky to get a really great moderator, Maureen McCann. She's a meteorologist with News 13 in Orlando, Florida. And so I think you're really going to enjoy the forum, and I think you can really enjoy the week. So with that, I'll introduce Maureen.
Thank you, Sandy. Wow, there's a lot of people here. We're in New Orleans. I'm sure a lot of you had a late night last night, so good to see so many people here. And I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you to the Presidential Forum, as Sandy mentioned, entitled Serving Society in Times of Crisis, Past, Present, and Future. And I'd like to thank Dr. Sandy McDonald for this incredible opportunity to be involved in this year's Presidential Forum. And a special thanks to the entire Presidential Forum Planning Committee. They're in the front row. And thanks to all the AMS staff and everyone who came together, put a lot of hard work in planning this session. We've been planning this for some 18 months. All of our Thursday morning monthly conference calls have culminated in this panel that I'm about to introduce. Here on stage with me, we have 4 speakers who well represent important areas of our AMS community. That includes weather forecasting, modeling, research, societal impact, and all of this is so topical for being here in New Orleans, and their work resonates with the overall conference theme, Earth System Science and Service to Society. Now that theme is also interwoven in my day-to-day work as a broadcast meteorologist, because being a TV meteorologist is being a service to society with the ultimate goal to keep viewers informed and safe. As a morning meteorologist, that's what gets me out of bed at 2 o'clock every morning. Now, I do want to make it clear that I wasn't in New Orleans for Hurricane Katrina, and I have the highest respect for those who were, and for those all along the Gulf Coast who were on the air August 29, 2005, and for those who informed their communities following the Deepwater Horizon incident. Truthfully, when Katrina made landfall, I was landlocked in Syracuse, New York, my second on-air job, and I was broadcasting live from the New York State Fair that day. But I remember that, like most of you in this room, I was captivated by the event, horrified at the devastation, and glued to the Weather Channel when I wasn't at work. There are many students and recent graduates in this room right now who recall Katrina as that benchmark event that called them to study meteorology. For me, it was Hurricane Gloria in 1985. I won't tell you how old I was. But since I work in a hurricane-prone area, being Central Florida, I strive to learn from past events like Katrina should I ever have to implement those best practices with a landfalling storm in or near my region. I've lived in Orlando for now 3 hurricane seasons, and thankfully, I've yet to participate in that type of coverage. There's nothing I love more than logging on to the NHC website and seeing in big capital letters, no tropical activity expected for the next 5 days. But I know we're not always going to be that lucky, so I want to be as best prepared to serve my community and society, which is why sessions like this are so crucial, so we can learn from each other, share ideas, and prepare all of us for the next major weather or environmental event of this caliber. So as for the format today, we're going to hear from each of our speakers individually. They'll each present, and then we're going to open the floor to the audience to take questions and engage in the discussion. If you don't feel comfortable stepping up to a mic, you can tweet using hashtag AMS2016, And we'll be following that hashtag and taking questions also from Twitter. And that way people who are not here can follow along as well. Speaking of which, I do want to get a picture of the crowd so I can tweet it out. All right, thank you. So enough about me. Let's hear about our speakers. First, we're going to hear from Max Mayfield. He is currently the hurricane specialist at WPLG in Miami, a position he accepted after a distinguished 34-year career of service at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's National Hurricane Center. He was the NHC director from 2000 to 2007, including the active Atlantic hurricane seasons of 2004 and 2005. He received a Presidential Rank Award for meritorious service from President George W. Bush in 2005 and was named ABC Television Network's Person of the Week after 2005's Hurricane Katrina. Mr. Mayfield earned a Master of Science in Meteorology from Florida State University and served as a weather forecaster in the United States Air Force after receiving a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics from the University of Oklahoma. In 2006, he received the Government Communicator of the Year Award from the National Association of Government Communicators, as well as the prestigious Neil Frank Award from the 2006 National Hurricane Conference for efforts to significantly improve the accuracy of hurricane forecasting as director of the National Hurricane Center, a factor which has undoubtedly helped save countless lives and property. The National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences Suncoast chapter has recognized Mr. Mayfield with 6 Emmy Awards, and he was named the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes 2015 National Weather Person of the Year. And then next, we'll hear from Admiral Tad Allen, Executive Vice President, Booz Allen Hamilton. He's a leader in the firm's business at the Departments of Justice and Homeland Security, focusing on emergency management, critical infrastructure protection, cybersecurity, emergency communications, and maritime security. He is a national thought leader in homeland security, maritime policy, law enforcement, and national resiliency. Known for his expertise in bringing together diverse parties to address major challenges and create unity of effort, Mr. Allen completed a distinguished career in the U.S. Coast Guard as its 23rd Commandant in 2010. Mr. Allen's crisis leadership experience includes responses to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, the Haitian earthquake, and port security operations in New York Harbor following the September 11th attacks. He is a fellow in the National Academy of Public Administration and a member on the Council of Foreign Relations. He also serves as director on the Coast Guard Foundation and Partnership for Public Service. He's a 1971 graduate of the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. He holds a master's in public administration from the George Washington University, from which he received the Alumni Achievement Award in 2006. He also holds a master's of science from the Sloan School of Management at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And we will go to MIT for our next speaker. That is Dr. Kerry Emanuel, who is the Cecil and Ida Green Professor of Atmospheric Science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's been on the faculty there since 1981 after spending 3 years on the faculty of UCLA. Professor Emanuel's research interests focus on tropical meteorology and climate with a specialty in hurricane physics. His interests also include cumulus convection and advanced methods of sampling the atmosphere in aid of numerical weather prediction. He's the author or co-author of over 200 peer-reviewed scientific papers and 2 books, including Divine Wind, The History and Science of Hurricanes, published by Oxford University Press and aimed at a general audience, and What We Know About Climate Change, published by the MIT Press. He's a co-director of MIT's Lorenz Center, a climate think tank devoted to basic curiosity-driven climate research. And our final speaker comes to us from not too far away here in New Orleans. Dr. Shirley Laska is a professor emerita of sociology and founding past director of the Center for Hazards Assessment, Response, and Technology at the University of New Orleans. Dr. Laska has been conducting applied research on the social and environmental interface, natural and technological hazards, and disaster response for 25 years. Her work includes studies on residential flood mitigation, hurricane response, coastal land loss effects, coastal fisheries, community risk assessment, and risk management for coastal hazards, coastal community resettlement engendered by sea level rise, and evacuation of the vulnerable. She has presented her work at National Academies of Science conferences and congressional committees. Since Katrina, her work has been specifically focused on lessons to be learned from the event, especially in the realm of community recovery and hazard resiliency. This work emphasizes participatory action research in both slow onset coastal land loss and sea level rise and abrupt major disaster events, Hurricane Katrina and the BP oil leak. She's the 2008 recipient of the American Sociological Association's Public Understanding of Sociology Award for her continuous collaboration with physical science and her presentations nationwide on Katrina and Rita impacts, awards from the ASA Environment and Technology section and the Rural Sociological Society's Natural Resources Research Group. Those are some big bios. So with that behind us, we want to invite up our first speaker, Max Mayfield. There you go.
I don't have to stand there, though, do I?
You can.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. I think we can all agree that Katrina was indeed an extreme event. But before I get into that, I'd like to say a few words to the young atmospheric scientists that are here today. I went to the National Hurricane Center in 1972, and they still had World War II vintage teletype machines. The forecasters would look at these really low quality facsimile charts, take a few notes, type that up on a clankety old typewriter, and give that to a communicator who would cut the teletype tape and feed it into the machine at the magic time, and that's how the forecast got out. I was also told about this gentleman who had recently retired before I got there, and his first job in the Weather Bureau back then was to fly a kite to take upper air observations. By the time he retired, we had geostationary satellites. So one career of 35 or so years from kites to satellites is pretty amazing. Today, we have a wealth of fantastic observations, radar, satellite, model animations on our cell phones. We really should be so thankful for so many things that we have, but I just can't imagine what the next 35 or 40 years has in store for some of you young students out there. It really is an exciting time to be in meteorology. Well, let's take a look at the a real success story for the weather enterprise and the American taxpayer. This is a graph I want you to see. The track forecast errors from 1 to 5 days. You can see the trend line there is going down at all time periods. The forecasts are improving. Before Katrina in 2005, they've continued to pretty much improve every year since then. A couple of comments. One is that they're improving more at the longer time periods. And two, if you look at that red line, the one-day forecast, it's still pretty hard to, it's pretty hard to get significant improvement there. They're already so low. The forecast era in 1972, by the way, was the 3-day forecast era was nearly 700 nautical miles. 700 nautical miles for all the storms, the average for all the storms and hurricanes in 1972. And now the forecast era is about 45 nautical miles per day. This is the track forecast cone, sometimes called the cone of uncertainty. That upper left-hand graph shows the cone on a predictive forecast during Hurricane Katrina with the various improvements. The bottom right graph shows what that cone would look like today given all the improvements. Now, sometimes this graph is shown and people forget to say that in 2005 we were using a 10-year average. Now we're using a 5-year average, but the bottom line is the technology has allowed us to make that cone much, much smaller. In fact, one of the concerns now is that that cone is so small that the hazard, the tropical storm force winds, the tornadoes, the rainfall, the storm surge can extend well beyond that cone. This cone has served us well for a long time, but there are some limitations there. It's created exactly the same for all tropical cyclones, although the hurricane forecaster typically has a lot more confidence in the more intense tropical cyclones. And it also, we have a lot of additional information now, like the ensemble forecast. There's useful information there. The Hurricane Center obviously knows this, and they're working on, or at least thinking about, what can replace this cone eventually. If we look at the intensity forecasting, we usually hear there's not much of an improvement with intensity. I think you could look at this and make some case that there has been some improvement in recent years. But I think what the hurricane forecasters would like you to know is that on average they do a pretty good job, but they don't have confidence in forecasting the rapidly intensifying and the rapidly weakening tropical cyclones. And should also say that this doesn't really tell the whole story. In fact, look at Tropical Storm Erica from this last year. When it was east of the Caribbean, it was forecast by several of the models and the official forecast to become a hurricane either over or near South Florida. Yet it dissipated within 3 days' time. So there's nothing there to verify, so that is not reflected. There's no penalty for that. Well, there is a penalty, it just doesn't show up in that graphic. Now, having talked about the forecast, the forecasts were actually, by most standards, pretty good in Hurricane Katrina and Superstorm Sandy, but the loss of life still occurred and was certainly unacceptable. If we're going to do something about that loss of life, we need to look at how people have died and where they've died. Dr. Ed Rappaport, the Deputy Director of the National Hurricane Center, did a study looking at a 50-year period of how people died in the United States from tropical cyclones. 49% died from storm surge, the vast majority from the storm surge, 27% from the inland freshwater flooding, and if you add the surf-related deaths and the marine accidents, about 88% actually died from water-related hazards. Only 3% from tornadoes and 8% from the straight-line winds. So it's interesting to note that historically the Weather Service has issued watches and warnings for the wind. I mean, that's the definition of a tropical storm or a hurricane. They've issued watches and warnings for the flooding due to the heavy rain. They've issued watches and warnings for tornadoes, but not for the number one killer, the storm surge. Well, they're going to do something about that, and one reason they're going to do something about that is now they have the computational ability to show some really nice graphics like this. This is an example from the Florida West Coast near Fort Myers, showing the potential inundation in a probabilistic manner of the most likely areas to receive storm surge flooding. I think this is going to be a giant step. They'll eventually be issuing watches and warnings for storm surge along with graphics like this. I personally have a little bit of concern because all the local communities also have their individual storm surge evacuation zone maps that will not exactly match this, obviously, but having said that, the Weather Service would be negligent not to release this data, and it does need to get out there. Okay, I usually end talks by saying something about the various roles that people have, and I'll just mention a few today. The role of the forecaster is to issue the best forecast possible. But I learned a long time ago it's not all about the forecast. How you communicate that forecast, especially to the key decision makers, is extremely important. Before every single advisory comes out from the Hurricane Center, they have a coordination call with all the potentially impacted weather forecast offices, the Ocean Prediction Center, the Weather Prediction Center, the Storm Prediction Center. There's a lot of collaboration that goes on. NASA's online, the military is online. A lot of people in the federal community is really on the same page, but that's not the role of the forecaster to open up shelters or reverse lane highways and call for evacuation. That's usually the role, and it's done differently in different locations up and down the coastline, but that's usually the role of the emergency manager or local officials. And some people do a better job at that than others, but these emergency managers have written these emergency plans. They know the timelines of their local community. They know what's needed and how long it takes. Then the role of the media, and by the way, the role of the media is to help get the forecast out there and these very important emergency messages. And the media, the national media in particular, I think, from where I sit, overly focuses on the more populated areas, sometimes at the expense of the less populated areas. People have told me they don't know, nobody was really talking to them during a hurricane event. And these are only a few of the key players, but when these folks do their job better, then it's easier to get some of the desired outcomes, whether that's sheltering in place. And by the way, there are two pictures there on the bottom left that is called a Tale of Two Homes. This was in a hurricane. The top picture, the roof blew off, the windows blew in. That house was totally gutted. The picture in the bottom had no damage. The houses were right across the street from each other. We know how to build better and stronger. Sometimes we don't do it. Sometimes you call for the evacuations, but anyway, these desired outcomes are easy to get if the other jobs are done well. I've talked to a lot of people after a lot of hurricanes, and I can tell you one thing for certain: people who had a hurricane plan that they could execute did better than people who did not have a hurricane plan. And as we head into a more weather-ready nation, I hope that can move that along and help more people get prepared. If the able-bodied people had their plan for a hurricane or other disaster and knew what to do, then the governments and other agencies could focus on the elderly and the special needs people who will always need some extra attention. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Just get up. Okay.
Thanks, Max. He's the first panelist I've served with in about 5 years and finished on time. Great job, Max. And I'm going to use his slides, except I'm not going to show them again. To put a finer point on a couple of Max's comments, I came into the Coast Guard in 1971 and was assigned to a ship in Miami. Our major mission was to go out and get in a 10 by 10 mile square grid in the Atlantic Ocean and drift, and help the National Weather Service launch Raywinson balloons to predict the winds aloft. 10 years later, I was a commanding officer of a Coast Guard cutter on the coast of Oregon, and my job was to go out and moor buoys, sometimes 2 or 3 miles deep, that would replace those ships. Those are the buoys that Jim Cantori was talking about. They're so important and vital. We used a buoy to replace a 300-foot vessel with 150 people on it. Some of the extraordinary advances in technology, and I think we need to understand the power if we can get the technology onto those buoys. On the 6th of September, 2005, I landed 4 blocks away in an emergency LZ after being sent down by President Bush to become the deputy principal federal official to Mike Brown for the Katrina response. My first sight of New Orleans, other than flying over and seeing the immense devastation and the fact the city was still filled with water because we had not repaired the levees yet, was the inner lanes next to the convention center were piled high with 2 feet of garbage. And what had happened with the people that were forced into the convention center, and that followed the folks that evacuated to the Superdome that then was surrounded by 4 to 5 feet of water, with similar results there. And the week before I came down here, I, like everybody else, was kind of astounded that this could happen in the United States. How could this happen? Let me just give you some personal thoughts, and then I want to draw some conclusions, not dissimilar to Max's. What happened in New Orleans on the 29th of August, 2005, we thought was a hurricane. The hurricane was gone in 24 hours. In fact, the Coast Guard on the 29th, around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the brave aviators and crews from Air Station New Orleans were flying missions over the city in 40-knot winds as soon as they could get access. This was not an issue about people down here not trying to do a good job. When I arrived here a week later on the 6th of September, I came to a startling conclusion, and I've mentioned it many times in public, but let me restate it here. The problem in New Orleans, there was a hurricane, but the real problem that needed to be solved was they lost continuity of government. They lost the command and control communications and organizational structure that would allow them to take the immense amount of resources that have flowed into this city for a week and apply it to any kind of mission effect. And as you all know, disaster response by law is a local responsibility. All power is not granted to the federal government, reserved to the states, so we had this tension between the ability of local leaders to function when we actually had a breakdown in continuity of government, and then the role of the federal government trying to figure out what to do. That caused, in my view, a virtual policy stalemate to paralyze the city for about a week. We need to learn from that. We need to learn from that. In the days following that week after I got here, we got together with General Russ Honore, who led the Joint Task Force from U.S. Northern Command. We divided the city into sectors, started a methodical search. We touched every house. Remember the symbols with the circles and the icons to say when we had been there, what we had found. Over the course of the next 12 days, we actually did 3 sweeps of the city, a hasty sweep, secondary, and a tertiary sweep to make sure there was nobody left to save. And at that point, people had elected not to leave, couldn't live anymore under the conditions. Then to start the very, very difficult issue of remains recovery, which was one of the most difficult things we did during that response. Throughout that period, the number one issue that I focused on was unity of effort and trying to create a sense of shared values where everybody could direct it towards the people that needed the help, subordinate parochial interest, and focus what needed to be done, which was increase the velocity of the response, cut through red tape, try and get through the bureaucracy, and make things happen. In spite of all of that, there are certain things the best response cannot handle. As I was telling some folks earlier this morning, the event does not create the preconditions. To the extent you have high-density housing, transportation issues, evacuation plans, as Max said, that are not heeded, a local culture that doesn't value what leaders are trying to do in an emergency. At that point, you have basically a bathtub effect in community resiliency. And I like to equate resiliency to the human immune system. The stronger your immune system is, when you get a cold or an illness, you get through it and you get on with the rest of your life. Sometimes you don't get well. But in general, the stronger your immune system is, the better you're going to be able to cope with the problem. We need to think about resiliency, those things we do before an event, and how we can inform the behavior through the work that you all do to actually change the decision that individuals and cities make, whether it's building codes, or unless you've got your house roof torn off or you've been forced out by water, to be able to stay in your home for 72 hours with food and medicine, to be able to do that. Because, in effect, the first responder in any case is you. And the more resilient you are, the more the immune system you've got built into you and your family, as Max said, the less you're going to put a demand on services from emergency responders around you. You can be compliant with the requests made by leaders for what you should be doing, and you can assist your neighbor. To the extent that we all do that, we start to breed community-level resiliency. And we need to look at resiliency at all levels of government. We've got community resiliency, but sooner or later we're going to have to come to grips with building codes and our perpetual desire to rebuild structures on barrier islands that were never meant to stay in one place. These are public policy issues, the issues with how we insure these structures. We rebuild houses 3, 4, 5 times, and we subsidize that through the taxpayers. I sit on the Comptroller General's Advisory Board, Gene Dodaro, Comptroller of the United States. We are still carrying $20 billion in debt from payments that were made during Katrina that have not been covered by the flood insurance fees. That's an unsustainable model moving forward. So as you look at what you do for a living and the folks that are here that anticipate coming into this line of work, if you look at the value of what you do, it's really rather extraordinary, because the broadcasts that are made in advance of a storm start out with an observation somewhere. And that observation is kludged together with data, increasingly better, more accurate amounts of data that can be analyzed because of the increases in computational power we've experienced to be actually able to do things we were never able to do before. So the question is, moving forward, what is the best use of that aggregated data? What data do we need? But in my view, the best indicator of performance from the meteorological community will be their ability to translate that science into an understandable value proposition that changes behavior. That makes somebody say, as Max said, we need a plan. I need to know what my kids are going to do if they're in school and I can't get to them. We need to know if we have to move inland and our family is dispersed. Do we have a pre-designated spot where everybody knows if there's no communication, sometime that's where we'll all go? Do we have a way to receive weather forecasts without power, either hand crank, solar, or whatever? And can we continue to be in communication with those around us and understand what's expected of us by our political leaders? If we do that, we will increase our immunity and become more resilient, not only as communities and as a nation. Let me close by making one comment related to the oil spill. Things get very, very different when you have somebody to be mad at. Things get very, very different when you have property rights, negligence claims, and legal issues. That does not mean that we can sacrifice unity of effort, because all outcomes that are going to be needed to deal with these crises in the future are going to have to be co-produced, and co-produced by the government and the private sector. And that is a challenge moving forward. Thank you.
Very well done. Good morning. Today I get to play the ghost of Christmas's future up from my usual role as Scrooge. But before I begin, this is a session devoted to science in the service of society. And that's a terribly, terribly important theme for us all. And it's one of the things that makes our organization rather unique, because it's all about that. At the same time, I have my own message for young people in the audience, particularly those who are interested in research, that there's a very important role still to be played in this arena by basic curiosity-driven research, because the history of science tells us that some of the great leaps forward are very unpredictable and come from people who are just pursuing their passion for trying to obtain a better understanding of nature. So we mustn't lose track of that along the way. So I want to talk about where we're headed from Katrina. And if I can get the slides actually put up on the screen. I guess they're on two screens, right? Okay, fine, thank you. I want to talk a little bit about Katrina forecast to follow on from Max, a little bit about where we are in the whole science of predictability, and the terribly important problem, both from a basic research standpoint and from applications of forecasts of the whole business of quantifying forecast uncertainty, why we need to be moving quickly toward more probabilistic forecasting. A little bit about climate change, just to provoke some discussion during the discussion section, and just a little taste of where some of the directions I think we're headed in theoretical research on tropical cyclones. So as you've already heard, Katrina, like its later counterpart Sandy, had really excellent forecasts, especially for that era. Here are the track forecasts from a variety of objective guidance products and the National Hurricane Center from the 27th of August. And you can see that it's a pretty narrow cone of uncertainty, if you like, about where that storm was going to go. So we were blessed by very good track forecasts. The intensity forecasts are a bit different. This blue curve shows the history of Katrina's peak wind speed by date, and the red curves are successive forecasts issued by the National Hurricane Center out to 72 hours. And you can see that there's a lot to be desired here. And this is by no means to pick on NHC. This is really the state of the art. Nobody does it better than they do it. But as Max mentioned to you, we have a long way to go in predicting and perhaps understanding what controls the intensity of hurricanes. For example, it's only been recognized in the last 2 decades how important the upper ocean is, and we don't observe the upper ocean all that well, particularly, oddly enough, not in the Gulf of Mexico. And what you're seeing here are some hindcasts of, again, Hurricane Katrina's intensity, the best track estimate being in blue, the green being sort of our best shot at modeling it in hindsight, knowing what the environment was, what the track was, and so forth. And the red curve is what happens if we shut off mixing of the upper ocean after 18 GMT on the 28th. And you can see that the landfall intensity in that case would have been much larger, and the storm would have presumably been that much more devastating. And so this whole business about upper ocean mixing, I would argue, originated in curiosity-driven research. It hasn't evolved all the way to practicality because we're still not doing a very good job measuring the thermal structure of the upper ocean. Now, we took the same modeling framework and we said what would happen if we had Katrina in the thermodynamic environment of 1980 rather than 2005. That's the green curve. And you can see that the storm, if it had been exactly the same storm, same track, same kinematic environment, but the thermodynamic environment of 1980 would have been considerably weaker, all right? So that's climate change. Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, that it's global warming. As a matter of fact, we think the climate change in this case was anthropogenic, but not greenhouse gas driven. It might have very well been a consequence of the Clean Air Act and our cleaning up of sulfate aerosol pollution. That's something for you to think about a little bit. More and more, we're turning back to basic understanding of the fundamental predictability of things like hurricane intensity. We like to treat it as a practical problem, and it certainly is that, but how well can you do? So here is a bunch of, this is a graph summarizing some relatively recent experiments that build on the work of John Moskaitis and Fusheng Zhang and others about how susceptible the intensity is to initial error. So this is just showing you an envelope of outcomes of hurricane intensity with exactly the same track, exactly the same environmental conditions, but errors in the initial intensity. And we don't do a very good job, by the way, measuring initial intensity to this day. And the dashed lines show 5 and 95% confidence intervals, and you can see that after a few days you just completely lose it, all right? This is not for practical reasons. This is theoretical. Hurricanes in moderate shear may prove to be inherently not very predictable. And you can throw all the money at it you want and all the airplanes and all the satellites. You can't beat the initial error down to 0, okay? You may have to live with some fundamental lack of predictability. We don't know this for sure. This is why it's so important to do basic research in arenas like this. So on the more practical side, one of the things we'd like to do is to better quantify our uncertainty based upon the fact we don't know the initial conditions, we don't know the forecast state, large-scale state well. So one of the things we try to do is to turn to very large ensembles of hurricane models run with large-scale boundary conditions provided by global forecast models. Here you're seeing for a particular storm in 2010, a very large ensemble of something like 100 tracks produced just by varying slightly the initial conditions compared to the forecast track and the observed track. And when you start to get to very large ensemble members, you can do a better job with uncertainty. And this is a sort of product. This happens to be for wind, but we need to do it for other quantities like surge that I think we're all sort of striving for in the end. This happens to be a forecast wind exceedance probability for Bermuda, for the storm that I just saw, based on actually a 1,000-member ensemble. And the observed peak wind at Bermuda, by the way, was 59 knots for this. Now, producing this information is a big scientific and technical challenge, but we can do it. Digesting that information and getting people to act on it rationally is probably even a larger challenge. And that's where we need all the help we can get, for example, from social scientists. And I think many of us believe that quantitative probabilistic forecast should become the primary guidance and serve as also the major basis for our post-assessment of forecast skill. Now, just a few research directions, and I can't possibly cover the bases here. One of the things we're beginning to realize is how important the outflow layer of hurricanes is. And this occurs near the tropopause, where most of our research aircraft don't fly. But recently, we've been able to make progress with a project sponsored by ONR on tropical cyclone intensity, flying B-57s and Global Hawks up in the lower stratosphere and dropping SONs, and we're going to learn some really interesting things about hurricanes, I'm sure, from that. We're going to continue to work on the predictability horizons. We don't really know what they are, particularly for hurricane intensity. We don't. It may be 2 days in some cases. It may be longer. We just don't really know. We ought to know that before we throw a lot of money into making these predictions better. The problem that was really stimulated more than anything else by Katrina, the climate control of hurricanes, continues to be a very interesting and active subject of research, as is the feedback of hurricanes on climate itself, something that doesn't generally get as much attention. And the old problem of the genesis of hurricanes remains front and center. Dry hurricanes, what's that all about? This is some work done by Tim Cronin at Harvard. We just run a model into a state of radiative convective equilibrium. No water, okay? We have a dry adiabatic troposphere. Well, guess what? You get hurricanes. Here is a movie showing how they form spontaneously in this state. No water. All right, so all of those who read your undergraduate textbooks, hurricanes are driven by latent heat release. There isn't any. Okay, think again. By going back to basics and really rethinking things and stop worrying right away about the real world, okay, ultimately we do, go back to basics, you might learn some really surprising and interesting things. So let me summarize here. We're certainly making, as Max showed you, continued progress in hurricane track predictive skills since the time of Katrina. There is some indication of a slow erosion in intensity errors. I think that's rather tenuous at this point. We, on the other hand, think that we've achieved somewhat better understanding of controls on intensity and on fundamental predictability limits. For example, the ocean mixing problem I mentioned. There's growing recognition, although I think it's come fairly slowly to the field of hurricane forecasting compared to other arenas, if I can be a little critical, of the value of probabilistic forecasting. And finally, tropical cyclone research remains lively and productive, and I'm sure that will be true if we convene again on the same subject 10 years from now. Thank you very much.
Good morning. You're going to be seeing the third version of how to present. I've decided to read from my text because I have quite a few things I want to cover, and as someone born in New England who talks rapidly, I think I might be able to do it if I follow my texts. So, okay, let me get the system going here. Okay, thanks to Sandy, Dr. McDonald, for inviting me to represent the ground zero scientists, applied scientists, disaster practitioners on this 10th anniversary of Katrina. I want to also thank the AMS for including me in several of your other annual conferences between Katrina and now. You have been very respectful of our efforts. Like all the survivors of Katrina, I would prefer not to remember Katrina. We want to be on with our lives. Per the occasion, I will briefly describe my experiences with the other survivors. However, the challenge of that desire not to remember will be my theme of this brief talk, and I hope supportive of the conference's theme. I will begin by addressing the stages of the event. As a survivor, I experienced the evacuation and sheltering in Lafayette, Louisiana, with only what would fit into my car, my pet in tow, and I, like everyone else, in shock. I was extremely fortunate and benefited from early warning and a welcoming colleague at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. The evacuation experience for many was deadly, initially taking over 1,500 lives, and putting survivors both still in the city and where they ended up being sheltered in unimaginable circumstances. My applied adaptation center at the university, called UNO Chart, was totally destroyed by mold, despite it being housed in a brand new building. The roof leaked and dripped water into the walls of each floor. Recovery for the center required 5 moves, beginning in a tiny office generously offered by the Lafayette faculty, to a New Orleans apartment on high ground near the river, to the bullpen of a collaborating business, to the least damaged end of an empty building on campus with birds still flying through it, to the final location today that is still challenged by mold. Recovery of the public infrastructure has created a community that appears and is to be recovered, and is to a great extent. However, the personal lives of many thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, are still not back to normal. The government struggles with the process of supporting survivors to regain control of their lives. We call this agency. That leads not only to disrupted lives, but also to what I would say perhaps even thousands of deaths from the stress of the survivor's situation. Heart attacks, strokes, perhaps even cancer, suicides, the elderly dying before their time. Except for the Coast Guard, as we as a society and the government institutions who manage disasters don't yet know how to assist survivors to regain control of their lives after a disaster. As a result, many of our residents who want to return have not been able. There are 75,000 fewer minority residents in New Orleans than before Katrina. It is this third phase of disasters, the continual adaptation to prevent future disasters, that I want to spend the next few minutes discussing. As a species, I suspect survival has required full attention to the immediate threat, not to the past. It probably also includes a desire not to deal with the horrific if one doesn't have to. For example, we try not to think about dying. As a species, at least as a culture, we do not want to engage regularly in thinking about what we might expect about something bad happening to us. This is twisted from the other way we might expect people to react, to be constantly preoccupied with never letting it happen again. It appears that avoidance of thinking about bad experiences wins out. My own home was undamaged due to a storm-resistant roof that I installed just prior to Katrina because my insurance company required that I replace the roof to continue insuring me. Because of the qualities of the roof, taught to me by the chief engineer of the Institute of Business and Home Safety, whom I know professionally, I did not get a drop of water in my home, despite there being a huge tree on the roof for almost 4 months after the storm. This is an example of my profession having given me access to such knowledge and enough commitment to follow through with the adaptation once nudged by the insurance company. We need to help every citizen and public official to consider, learn how, and implement adaptation to the risks that they and their communities will likely experience. This is the most challenging phase of a disaster, especially in a community that is surrounded by levees. We call them moral hazards because they help us to forget about our personal adaptation responsibilities. Assisting us adaptation experts in creating an awareness and commitment to adapt is where weather, water, and climate scientists and practitioners come in. Let me explain what I mean. Coastal Louisiana is at an extreme risk to storm inundation from a combination of sea level rise, subsidence, erosion, and being in a popular hurricane path. It is important that this fact be communicated clearly and regularly to the residents. It is very evident that mapping inundation both over the long run and for specific events catches the interest and response of the residents and public officials here. The visual tools, the products that you, the specialized scientists and practitioners, create are a critical means of communicating this risk to the residents. I see their interest and attention to such maps over and over and over again. It is based on this response of coastal Louisianians that I offer some suggestions for your making an even larger contribution. I strongly encourage you to create the best communications, maps, and forecasts from the best science and technology that you are able to do. In addition, I strongly encourage you to increase your partnering with social science communications experts to achieve the best communication. I was at the Severe Weather Center when the Weather Ready Nation was born. Social scientists with communication expertise can help you to enhance the explanation of your tools. Here is an example of an improvement in communicating the content of maps. The Louisiana Ag Extension specialists are taking the FEMA flood maps and adding easily accessible, useful information to them. The extension specialists are also taking the time to help the reader interpret what they are seeing. Now, I know this is a bit difficult perhaps for you to see, but it describes what the viewer is seeing on the maps. The agents have also gone to the parishes, our counties, to obtain what the officials want the residents to know. These efforts are critically important. It is the difference between the residents using the FEMA maps and not using them. It is that important of a difference. I encourage you to go that extra step with your products and your forecast maps. While we understand that products that can be applied to more than one region of the U.S. are more efficient and cost-effective, it is also critical to have local qualities included in your products. For example, the coastal Louisiana is subject to subsidence. The federal agency data points for this area are limited and perhaps are located on more firm ground than other parts of the general vicinity. Other data should be reviewed, such as is presented on this poster, to be sure that the most precise representation is given. Making local refinements requires working closely with local scientists and technical experts. And you will see the box with the arrow as the area in which the subsidence has occurred, but it's not where the data points are for the subsidence measurements. Products applicable to national issues are efficient to produce and cost-effective. However, there are likely to be local challenges to them that the public and public officials need to know about in detail. Storm inundation maps are currently being released in the coastal areas of the U.S. Two of the previous speakers have spoken about this. There are two issues that I am aware of for coastal Louisiana that would strongly benefit from more engagement with local residents and officials by the map specialists who created them. First is the challenge of the levied area and what that visual means to the non-expert. While there is very good chance that at the high end of the inundation risk that the levees will be compromised, showing the interior flooding is difficult to do because of the lack of modeling of how it would happen. Note the dry levied areas of the greater New Orleans area and the Lafourche Parish. You can see where the arrow is for Orleans Parish. Here is what the media is saying about it. There is a serious concern that residents will see the map and believe that they are safe when they might not be. Evacuation is an extreme challenge, and this map may contribute to less evacuation. Having devoted a lot of applied research time to the question of enhancing evacuation prior to Katrina, This issue is particularly troubling to me. Since we submitted these slides, another challenge has come up with the same map. The newspaper blog, that's the place that the newspaper puts out so that the reader can respond, indicates that some readers believe that the map has been produced to support the climate change position because the water goes so far inland to Baton Rouge. It may be that such a dramatic finding should never be released without significant planning and use of agency communications specialists to explain how such an inundation could be possible. The map may produce just the opposite effect than intended, disbelief rather than belief in the possible extreme inundation. Two final recommendations. Excuse me, okay. Two final recommendations. I encourage you to triangulate your studies and products, not to have a single one. While refining just one report or visual product might again be efficient and cost-effective, the resistance to climate change may not be served by only one report. We have a local example that's very interesting. The director of a local business nonprofit who might not have been expected to accept the inundation models says this: one report is easy to ignore, but similar scenarios that keep coming out, at some point you can't ignore them anymore. This is a finding I think that's very critical. We have to direct information from different sources to those who might not be believers, so that they will appreciate that more than one agency, more than one scientist believes these findings to be the case. Finally, I ask you to partner directly with regional adaptation programs, whether here, if you live in the greater New Orleans area, or with adaptation organizations wherever you live around the country. Here are 10 very active local university, nonprofit, and state government adaptation centers across coastal Louisiana. There are community outreach specialists in each of these who are working tirelessly to encourage adaptation. We hope that we can form tighter relationships with you because your work is so important to ours. You can communicate the risk in ways that keep people's attention, keep their eye on the prize. That is, of course, continual adaptation. We need you and not just your products. Here is the model that the state of Louisiana has for its organization, showing the different ways in which adaptation can occur, and they all require mapping to be successful. We want Katrina to be a continual lesson about the need for adaptation rather than a memory. I would like to end with a plug for this week in the Societal Application Symposium, the Weather Ready Nation, the Post-Katrina Innovations, and also the session that Nancy Bell Sims is having Wednesday morning, and the new AMS journal that just came out has related ideas with regard to the same idea. We need you to personally partner with local and regional citizens and officials in order for you to really be able to help us with the products that you produce. Thank you.
All right, well, at this point, we would like to open it up for discussion, questions. You can enter the aisles and go to the mics. I believe we have some questions coming in on Twitter, but we got someone already over there, so if you would like to ask the first question.
Good morning. Thank you all very much. I'm one of the pre-college teachers in the society and a longtime advocate for many of the ways in which the society can expand its impact by doing more with the teachers who then work with the students and the families. Do the panelists have any particular suggestions for how to expand this impact beyond what we're already doing with things like the data stream programs and many of the other outreach activities?
Just one thought. A while back, the state of California, how many people we have here from California? Started something called the Great Shakeout. And every fall when the kids come back to school, there's a mandatory drill, what's going to happen in the school system if there were to be a seismic event. That has actually taken on a life larger than itself, expanded into local communities and businesses, and now is an annual statewide drill that is done. I wouldn't say it's all over the state, but it's growing very rapidly and has moved to some other states as well. The theory behind that is as you're doing education and working with outreach and with school children and so forth, you kind of take the same approach as we did in getting a seatbelt use and reducing smoking in this country by educating the generation that there are certain behaviors that are going to minimize your risk as you move forward. And I would take that as one really good example.
Right here.
Hi, Jared Lee from NCAR. A question mainly for Max Mayfield. What would you say the prospects are for the NHC for their cone of uncertainty, for them developing a dynamic cone that accounts for kind of the errors of the day, and if there's a bimodal distribution in the models, accounting for that instead of assuming that the errors from the last 5 years will be there for the storm when the actual current storm forecast might be much more divergent?
Well, I'll tell you what I can here, although Rick Knabb or someone from the Hurricane Center would be best to answer that. Even when I was at the Hurricane Center, we had a Joint Hurricane Testbed project from Dr. Jim Gerst from the Navy looking at how to change that cone based on how well the models agreed with one another. But it was rejected, and one reason the cone would, could flip-flop more than we'd like to see it flip-flop. So they're very aware of this. They know they need to do something, and I personally think the cone that exists today should be sent to the Smithsonian. But we need a reasonable, you can't just put out ensembles, or even if there's a bifurcation, it's not as simple as you might think. I would personally feel better if there was a project dedicated, and Rick, if you're in here, you might keep me straight on this, but I would feel better if the Hurricane Center were a little closer to getting a replacement to that cone than I think they are.
We have a question from Twitter.
Mic on? Okay. Thanks. David Stokowski was asking on Twitter, how can we change fundamental behavior of the public in light of improvement in hurricane forecasting?
I would begin again with the theme of my presentation, and that is to engage as closely as possible, face to face. We're a social media world, and yet sometimes we need to have a process of persuasion that is much more personal and demonstrates the commitment of the message deliverer to closer appreciation of the concerns of the users. When I hear you discuss the fact that it's all, and I'm saying this harshly, but I don't mean it, it's all their fault that they're not responding, it doesn't sit with me. It is a partnership, and we as the professionals need to be really giving our all, thinking and learning the methods to achieve a response on the part of those whom we are trying to persuade. And I think it will happen more rapidly than more of the finger wagging, hand on the hip, it's your fault that you're not responding. We certainly learned this with the evacuation of the poor in New Orleans. They could not evacuate many of them. It was not their fault that they didn't.
I think that's correct. I think to the extent you can have the metaphor for a pre-need relationship between government leaders based on decisions and behaviors that were taken that assume what it is you're trying to achieve as a community, then they're going to be more responsive to the direction and guidance is provided by leadership when it happens. I would tell you there was a marked difference in the local government's responses in Sandy than there was down here during Katrina, and I think this was fresh in their minds. And you saw National Guard called up, you saw evacuations. In fact, there was a storm before Sandy where Mayor Bloomberg suffered some criticism for evacuating when somebody said he shouldn't have. I think that ought to be something we do away with. We'd rather err on the side of getting those populations that are at risk out of the area and then being able to deal with it. But I think it's a process over time that builds a pre-need trust that actually makes it actionable when something does occur.
I remember very well after Hurricane Hugo in 1989, I was talking with, at the time, the chairman of the National Hurricane Conference, and he shocked me by saying, people don't respond to your warnings. They don't respond to the hurricane watch and the warnings. And I said, of course they do. I thought people did that, but he was right. And most people tell me that people really respond to what their local officials tell them to do. Again, it's not the forecaster's role to call for those evacuations or opening of the shelters. That's usually done at the local level by these people who have written their emergency plans. And from where I sit, we need to do a better job of getting people motivated. One of the biggest steps I think the Weather Service has made is to get this just a tremendous amount of input from the social scientists. That inundation graphic that I showed for the storm surge has been studied by more people. It's the most studied product, I think, of any product ever created in the National Weather Service because they've gotten all this input on the colors and all types of things on how to do that, and surveys from the user community, the public, emergency managers, and the media. They've been years in developing that product, and I think it's going to be a really good product. So that's one thing I think we're doing right, engaging the social scientists more than ever before.
I've had an ongoing conversation with Joe Nimick, who's the Deputy Director of FEMA, a former Coast Guard officer, and he envisions a day at some point where you can hit the geographical button on your phone, whether you're using Google Maps or whatever, and it comes up and it tells you to a high degree of accuracy where you're at in relationship to the risk map or the floodplain. So it's in or out right then, it's clear, it's authoritative, and it can guide behavior.
Yeah, thank you. There was a lot of different challenges that were presented this morning. My question is, do the panelists see a lot of the solutions to those challenges as more simple, the need for more bright line rules, simple approaches, or are we delving into areas of complexity? Certainly in meteorological science and research, a lot of projects have gone into the complex direction, a lot of ensembles. It's not to say that simple things are easy, but should we be trending towards simple, complex, or a mix of both? Thank you.
You know, in a tornado, everybody knows what to do. You get in that innermost room of very many windows and hunker down, but with a hurricane and some other disasters, it's just not that simple. There will never be a single index or a single graphic that, in my opinion, conveys all the hazards in the hurricane. It's more complicated, and you need to have a hurricane plan that accounts for each hazard. And I think there are ways now with these graphical products that are coming out that will help tremendously, but it's not simple, and we haven't really figured out not just how to communicate that, but motivate people to do something about it. And one study I remember after Hurricane Katrina, it's actually in a book called The Unthinkable by Amanda Ripley. If you haven't read that and care about these things, you really need to read it, because she looked at how people responded to various disasters. And in Katrina, one study showed that people who did not evacuate, the majority of them said that in this survey, they could have found a means to get out if they really wanted to, but they didn't leave because they were not convinced that it was going to be as bad as it was at their house. So, yeah, I haven't figured it out, but we've got to do a better job of motivating people.
Yeah, I would second Max's recommendation on Amanda's book. She actually embedded with me for about 48 hours during Katrina and followed me around, and very accurate portrayal of what Max was talking about. But the other issue, I mean, we all understand this, if models were perfect, crime would have stopped when they issued the Ten Commandments. Okay? You're always going to have a level of complexity that's going to start to challenge either because scope or scale and start to defeat doctrine, procedures, protocol, and even contractual obligations. I think the Ebola virus is probably a better example of that, where normal operating procedures started breaking down because of people's perceptions. So I think we need to figure out a way to address complexity and start breaking that down into sections that can be addressed. And during the oil spill, what I tried to talk about was well control, transmission of oil where you can attack it, and then the consequences once it reaches shore. If you can break it into 3 parts, it becomes less aggravating, and you can address the piece parts. But the complexity is a risk aggravator. I think it's something we need to understand better.
And I'm convinced that there will always be, a certain percentage of people who will never do anything to prepare. There will always be a relatively small percentage of people who are maybe over-prepared. I mean, I've got impact-resistant windows and shutters on my house, a metal roof. I've even got stainless steel soffit vent covers so the wind-driven rain can't get into my soffit vents. So I think I've done everything that I can do. But it's just not as simple. We need a better way to motivate people to take action. And that group of people in the middle there that, can be convinced, we've got to focus on them.
What we've found, for example, in evacuating the city of New Orleans is that the evacuation is incredibly complex. But what you want to do is you want to learn the most important best practices, and you want to drill them very carefully. You want to make sure that they're continually well-resourced, and then the outcome will be a more simple process. Because if the end process is too complex, then it will not be managed adequately and the evacuation will fail. So I would say at different points of the consideration of the issue, it's very complex, but you want to refine to more systematic, clear steps that the volunteers, the officials can take together systematically.
Someone waiting down there.
Oh, hi, and it's Craig here. And in 2002, there was a series in the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans newspaper, that had the impacts of potential levee overtoppings and breaks and the catastrophic flooding, which for the most part came true in Katrina, although the death toll they calculated was about 18,000, which thankfully, for the tragedy it was, did not nearly get that high. But there was a sense that we knew even before Katrina that the flooding and overtopping or breaking of levees was certainly possible, yet the message did not get through to the general public with the evacuation. There are other cities in the U.S., to name 2, the Tampa Bay area and Savannah, Georgia, that have not had a hurricane impact in nearly or well over 100 years, and yet are certainly capable of an extreme disaster. How is the message for those kind of areas that have not seen a hurricane of full potential to get through to avoid another Katrina in the vulnerable areas? Thank you.
I think it gets back to this notion of community resilience and pre-need relationships. There are a lot of things that can happen to a community, and the areas you mentioned could also be impacted by destructive weather and violent storms, even tornadoes and so forth. I think this really has to be a social contract between the residents and leadership. And again, earlier I was talking about trying to change behaviors at the individual level and even at the state and local level on zoning and land use and things like that. To the extent you have that open, transparent discussion, even if you don't get to closure on it, when something happens, there'll be a far more educated community population base who'll be able to understand and be compliant with what the leaders are trying to do at the time.
I remember one congressional hearing after Katrina, and one of the senators asked me when I first became concerned for New Orleans, and I responded about 60 years earlier. I mean, there was a hurricane in 1947 that flooded the area. I mean, everybody I knew understood that New Orleans could flood. One thing that I've been in the hurricane program about 45 years now, and the one thing I'm really tired of hearing after some hurricanes, the response from some local officials that don't call for a mandatory evacuation because they don't think they have legal authority to do so. You can't wait till the last minute to have your city or county lawyers tell you that, yeah, okay, you can shut down businesses and close schools and whatever. I've said it thousands of times, you know, the battle against the hurricane is really one outside the hurricane season. And, you know, those things you need to have figured out and plans in place way in advance.
Down there.
Hello, my name's Kyle, and a few years ago, a tropical storm came right through Louisiana, and Bobby Jindal, before it hit, declared state of emergency, but evacuation was not stressed. And I was part of one of the parishes that flooded with 5-foot water just from that tropical storm. Should any further storms other than hurricanes with great potential have state of emergency with stressed evacuation?
It all depends, I think. I think all of us could say something about this, but it just depends on the situation. And that's a good example of, in fact, I remember Amanda Ripley's book again. You know, it's not just the what. You need, people want to know the why. You know, we're good at reading, you know, I'm in the media now. We spend a lot of time reading numbers, but, you know, I like to spend more time telling people why things are happening. And you just, it's not about the numbers. I'll give you an example on the opposite of what your example said. This year with Tropical Storm Erica, I thought we were doing a really good job in talking about the probabilities and the uncertainty, and the Hurricane Center was, for the most part, consistent on saying that there was a chance this could even fall apart because of wind shear in the mountains in Hispaniola and Puerto Rico. And then, you know, I really thought we were doing a good job, even though it was forecast to become a hurricane over near South Florida. And then on Thursday, the governor of Florida declared a state of emergency. And that came through the news department. I didn't even know they'd done it yet. And I knew what that meant. I mean, the governor could do that to get the National Guard on the hook. They could execute contracts without going through the procurement process. There are a lot of things that can do that. But he didn't tell people why he did that. And I know Brian Norcross with the Weather Channel was doing an interview, and you know, you know, if you ask him what does that mean, and he actually answered correctly and said, well, right now it just means to watch it, and if you don't have a hurricane plan, you know, get it together and know what you're going to do if it keeps coming as forecast. But he didn't say that. Anyway, the point's very well taken. You can't just put out a bunch of numbers or watches and warnings. You have to tell people what to do, and you know, there's a tremendous amount of hand-holding that goes on here, but most of that comes from the local officials and not from the forecaster. Although,
let's be honest here, folks. If you live in Plaquemines Parish and you don't have an elevated house and you don't have gas in your car, an emergency declaration is not going to make any difference. If you choose to live there, you need to understand the risk associated with that and when to leave. Flat, simple as that.
We've got time for one more question up front.
Got a question from Twitter, actually a combination of questions. Several people have been asking about what would happen today if a Hurricane Katrina came again? What's changed in terms of developments in meteorology or the way governments work together, the way they're changed the resiliency? And then I only have a few more minutes, so thank you.
Well, I think structurally, I'll let you comment on the climate, but structurally, they've basically altered the Mississippi River Gulf outlet. A flood barrier has been put in. There's been some massive Corps of Engineers projects that have taken place to resist the impact of storm surge and manage the funnel that was created by the Mississippi River Gulf outlet when the water was pushed up in there. So that has been done. The levees have been reinforced. But there's a limit to how much you can structurally prepare for one of these things when you don't know exactly what the full impact of the storm is, and I'll leave the rest to the other
And we
folks.
also have the levees set to achieve approximately a 1 in 100 risk chance of breaching. Compared to other parts of the world, such as the Netherlands, that's a very small or low level of risk reduction. And we also, of course, don't know that there might be some challenges that have not yet been discovered in the engineering of those. So we've got pretty high levee risks, and we also have lost many of the wetlands that are on the outside of the levees, and therefore the flow of the winds and the water, the surge, will be more rapidly to threaten those levees. So we have some serious issues to deal with, and there will never be the investment of resources to a catastrophe as there was with Katrina, as was mentioned earlier. So we've got to learn how to get better at reducing our risk in case something like that were to happen again.
Let me just interject here that if you want to think more on the 50-year time scale than the 10-year time scale, the next Katrina might be in 50 years. The sea level is going to be higher, folks. And a lot of the things you've talked about in terms of measures and levees may prove to be futile. The real question we should be asking here is how much longer will there be a New Orleans?
Yeah, I would recommend whoever in this audience hasn't read Rising Tide and the history of the control of the Mississippi River as a navigation channel and the diversion of water from replenishing the delta needs to read that. It's the first thing I told anybody that came to work for me during the hurricane. Go off in a corner, read this book, come back when you're done.
I think there are areas, many locations that are better off than, since Katrina, but there are also some areas that are not, and I can see the same scenario or even worse happening, including the loss of life in several locations, and I hope that helps motivate a lot of the younger folks in the audience here today to help us out.
Thank you. How about a round of applause for our panelists?
Eventually, we're going to be in.
So as this presidential forum comes to a close, I encourage you to continue the discussion throughout the meeting over the course of your time here in New Orleans, whether it's during the coffee breaks in the exhibit hall, sharing a meal with colleagues old and new. It's through these exchanges that we can foster new ideas, new strategies, and new tools to advance Earth system science and service to society. And please keep the conversation going on Twitter. And don't forget, in this room at 12:15, there will be an informal town hall with Secretary of Commerce Penny Pritzker. Thank you so much.